My name is Elizabeth Maricola, and I'm the head of Children and Teen Services here at Darien Library. Thank you all for coming out in this delightful weather. There's no better place to be than the library on a rainy day, I think. So welcome. This is the first program that the library is co-sponsoring with Darien SEPAC for the fall. There are 2 more coming up. So if you didn't grab one of those information forms that has the info about the next 2 programs on it, please do before you leave. Before we start, I'd like to thank the Friends of the Darien Library, without whom we would not be able to offer such amazing programs, and introduce Courtney and Jamie from Darien SEPAC.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate you all coming out to Understanding Anxiety. Most of all, we want to thank Darien Library, who's always amazing, tremendous. They go out of their way to make this run smoothly, so we can't thank them enough. We also want to take a second to thank the educators and administrators who attend. I know Shirley Klein, our Assistant Superintendent for Special Education and Student Services, is in the back. And also we have Mary Scalise, who's the department chair of the middle school, who's, I know, planning to attend if she's not already here. A few things we just wanted to mention is that the presentation today is being videotaped, and we will cut that off before there are questions. And then just a quick thing about upcoming programs. So we have 2 coming up right here in October. The first is Finding the Right Colleges for Students with Learning Differences with Michelle Berg on October 2nd. And then we have our very first webinar with Cheryl Jorgensen, who's actually up in Vermont and is an expert and an author on inclusion and creating an authentic inclusion, and that is on Monday the 22nd at 11:30.
Hi, welcome everyone. I just want to take a moment to introduce our speakers today. Elizabeth Jorgensen is the owner and director of Insight Counseling in Ridgefield, where she and Dr. Mary Murphy offer a wide variety of therapeutic counseling and coaching services, including biofeedback, executive functioning, academic coaching, cognitive behavioral, dialectical behavioral, and there was a lot more, substance abuse counseling as well. So I encourage you to review their website, and if anyone would like to get the slides, the information from this program emailed, there's a sheet at the front desk for that. Thank you very much. We're excited about your presentation.
All right, so I'm Mary Murphy. As Jamie introduced, I'm a clinical psychologist at Insight Counseling with Liz, and our practice is a private practice in Ridgefield, Connecticut, and there I'm the director of psychology services and psychological testing services. So I spend a lot of time with people trying to evaluate and diagnose kind of upfront accurately what clinical disorders people have, including anxiety, in all the different forms that it comes, and being able to set up people on the correct path of what would be a customized treatment plan. And like Jamie mentioned, there's different methods that we use that are very tailored to anxiety, and so we'll speak about them because there are versions of everything that's appropriate for parents to be able to use and deliver to work directly with your child. So biofeedback's one of them. It's a really great, handy self-empowerment, self-regulation tool that I want you to know how to access and be able to get an introduction to so that you can use it with your children. The other thing I just wanted to mention before we start is that in addition to our clinical practice, a lot of what our experience comes from is also being parents of special needs kids. And so I'll say for myself, my daughter was born with a mild form of cerebral palsy and a whole host of neurological issues. And so as a result of that, she now also has grown into full-fledged attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. For those of you who know, attention disorders don't always have that hyperactive part. She has the big one, the big H. She has a lot of it. You know, you could diagnose it from across the room. And so we also kind of come from this from the point of view of being on the other side of the table, not only having been the people that diagnosed problems with kids, but also in our own lives.
And I just wanted to share briefly. So my husband Matt and I are very lucky. We have 4 children. They're all grown. My oldest is 32. My youngest is 20, and 2 of the 4 have learning challenges. One very severe, actually, auditory processing problems. And I'm so glad that you're doing the college program about, there weren't any, when we were looking for colleges, I had to hire somebody independently. There was very little advice for how to pick the right school for a child with special needs. But one of the things I want to share today, and I'm going to get in, Mary and I work in tandem, but she's the college professor. She forgot to mention that she's also a college professor. So she does the slides and the data, and then I jump in and just interrupt. But I have to say, one of my greatest pains as a mother is I did not get the kind of thorough evaluation that Mary does. Got a very good, competent psycho-ed evaluation, but missed that my daughter also had severe anxiety. And you think that I would know that being a therapist, but she is a high-functioning person. Many of you probably have children maybe with high IQ who also have learning disabilities. She masked it so well until she started having panic attacks in high school, and it breaks my heart to this day. And she'll occasionally remind me that I really blew it, so hopefully we'll get past that. Eventually, it just broke my heart because she didn't present in a typical way. She didn't have obsessions. She didn't have rituals. She didn't need a whole lot of comfort, like at night and stuff like that. But meanwhile, she had internal ruminations all the time. And so it's not that easy to pick out the impact of anxiety. So we're here kind of with a lot of data, but also in humility as parents who've been there, done that, tried things that worked, tried things that didn't work. And you'll hear a lot of emphasis from us about getting the right eval, because typically, and I will say this, this is my 32nd year practicing with people. I'm not competent in a clinical session to evaluate some of the fine differences between anxiety disorders and the sequelae of learning disabilities. It's very, very difficult to pick out.
Okay. So I just wanted to mention what we're going to cover today so that we're using all the same language and it all makes sense. We're going to just talk about what is anxiety, what the clinical definition of it is, and then we're going to talk about WRON is what medical professionals use as the wide range of normal. Most of us live in the wide range of normal, and then there's the outliers where it becomes a clinical disorder. And so how does it look different when you have somebody with a learning disorder? How does anxiety present differently? And then, so what does clinical anxiety look like versus everyday stress? We're going to talk about the differences. And then interventions, the how-to practical part. I'm a very practical person. I want to be sure that you feel like there's how-to things that you can go home and be able to start doing. And know the difference between the line at which you need to have somebody else brought into the picture to help with the next level of intervention. So that's what can the professionals do as well. So when we're looking at a physical illness, like, you know, none of us get a guidebook as a parent, but we all know kind of like what to do. If they get sick, there's a roadmap for that, right? Like, we understand, all right, we got to go into the mode of, we got to call the pediatrician, we got to figure out if they need antibiotics, we're going to get them that chicken soup, give them a teddy bear, put them in the bed. We know what to do, okay? There's always a roadmap for that. But then when we see emotional symptoms, we sometimes freeze up and we're like, oh, wait, is this a problem? Is this something we should be doing something about? We don't know when to worry and when we're worrying too much. So there isn't a guide for this. So I want you to know some of the basics, okay? So when you talk about anxiety, it's the most common emotional issue. So what you're seeing, don't question yourself. If it's happening, it's a very, very common issue. I'll talk about the difference between anxiety and stress in a minute, but just know how prevalent this is, okay? When kids are very young, there's about a 9.5% prevalence of clinical anxiety, so 2 to 5 years old. Then it wildly jumps up. So when they are between 13 and 18, it jumps up to basically 1/3 of all kids actually would meet criteria for an anxiety disorder. Around age 11 is the average. So when you start to see peaks, this does kind of coincide with puberty, but it actually starts quite a bit before that as well. So that's how common it is. And what you've noticed is that women, girls, females will actually experience it more. By the time you're looking at lifetime, women versus men, women are 60 times more likely to have anxiety than men. So over the course of our lifetime, it actually gets more and more different than males. We become anxious and we usually stay there. And this is without intervention, of course. So the big message is that anxiety is absolutely treatable. And 80% of kids with a diagnosable anxiety disorder aren't actually getting into treatment. They're not getting recognized. And so we want to be able to help parents, because you're on the front lines, you're on the forefront of being able to decide, is there something that needs to be done? So what do we mean? What is an actual clinical anxiety disorder? I just wanted to point out that there's, our DSM is our Bible. That's how we diagnose. We look through a list of symptoms and we say, okay, if you have 5 of these symptoms and 2 of these symptoms, it equals anxiety disorder. And there's different kinds. So this is why it's really hard. You might talk to a friend and say, okay, my kid is biting their nails all the time and they're grinding their teeth at night while they're asleep. And then your friend will say, well, my kid doesn't do that, but they're worrying all the time. It looks so different in different kids. And so there can be generalized anxiety. There could be really specific. I'll show you the 2 different categories. There's generalized, where it's kind of across like broad different topics. I say that it kind of hops around. You can have anxiety that hops around to all different topics. And then there could be really specific things, like we know there's phobias, which I didn't write. Then there's specific like separation anxiety. Then there's specific anxiety related to being in social situations or in relation to certain subjects in school. And so there's lots of different versions of this, and that's what makes it confusing to parents, right? It becomes very hard to understand, is this an issue, and what it doesn't look the same across different people, so it makes it harder to kind of capture, is something really a problem? Like if we have a broken leg, it's going to look the same for everybody, right? Much easier to tell. But if you have anxiety showing it 100 different ways, it's very hard for us to even rely on our support systems. We can ask our spouse, we can ask a friend and say, do you think they're anxious? And someone will say, oh, I don't know, my kid doesn't look like that. Because it takes on so many different forms.
Can I just step something in? One of my side interests is in the field called Evolutionary Psychology. And some of the stuff is a little stark that they write about and kind of terrifying. But one of the things that really helps our anxious patients is an explanation of the fact that anxious human beings kept the species alive since the beginning of time. Right. So anxiety actually served an amazing purpose and still does today. In fact, it's much more worrisome if we have a child that doesn't have any anxiety or very little anxiety. They'll tend to be very impulsive. They'll get themselves into trouble. They're sometimes into self-harming behaviors, like not on purpose, but they're just, can be all over the place. Anxiety alerts our nervous system to the fact that there may be a threat. Now, the problem is up until pretty much 200-300 generations ago, which sounds like a long time, but for Mother Nature, not so much, you would probably only meet about 100 people your entire life. You would have a very set, stable lifestyle where you were moving around all day long to gather your food and, just take care of yourself. So the anxiety would serve your nervous system to be prompted to survive. And for those of us who understand evolution, right, who survives passes on the genes that allow them to survive. So one of the things that and neuro researchers are saying is it's not necessarily that our culture creates the anxiety, although we certainly have a pretty anxiety-inducing culture, but also the people who are alive today are the descendants of people who had anxiety that kept the species alive. Does that make sense? We get a lot of the kids to finally feel okay about this. I go, you know what? Your ancestors, go 100 generations back, your ancestor was the one that told everybody around the campfire, it hasn't rained in 3 moons and you're still praying to the rain god and we gotta move the camp, right? And everybody would be like, kumbaya, we're praying to the rain god. But the anxious one would keep the species alive. The mothers with more anxiety would keep that baby right here. The baby would not be put down and be a victim of a predator. And that's a really important point. So anything that's a symptom that's as wide as something like anxiety served a biological purpose at a certain point in time and then is a bad fit often to our current circumstances. Does that make sense? And that way we kind of take it away from it being like always a disorder. It's just a bad fit often with a particular child in a particular environment. Does that make sense?
Yes. And that is the perfect segue to explaining that there are different parts of, so there's stress, and then when it gets to a more extreme version, we call it clinical anxiety. So when you look at everyday stress, it is adaptive. It is actually, the difference is that you have everyday worries and they're in response to reasonable everyday stresses. And it's adaptive. It motivates us. Like if we didn't have a deadline, if we didn't have something like our watches to tell us like, oh, we got to be somewhere, or, oh, this is ending, we would not have the motivation to keep going. So, so I'm sure you notice this with kids and homework, like, oh, the night before, oh my God, I got to get this done. So it's motivating, okay? So stress can actually keep us safe, like we talked about, and it motivates you. Now, a low level of anxiety that a child can move on from is functional. So it's usually tied to something situational, something that's coming up, and like maybe a test the next day, starting something new or meeting somebody new. And the difference is that it goes away. It doesn't stay in that hyperdrive. So when you have a clinical level of anxiety, the worries are the same, everyday stresses might spark it, but it doesn't go away. The recovery from that doesn't actually start to, calm down. So it causes a significant level of distress and it doesn't go away. So it interferes with their functioning in different areas. Mostly they live at school, right? So they start to have problems at school. And when they start to have really moderate or high levels of anxiety, they start to even have physical symptoms. That's another like line in the sand where you could start to say, this is becoming a problem for my kid. They're starting to get heart racing and pounding and stomach aches, tummy aches, all about the tummy aches and the headaches, right? That's when those things start to happen. We've crossed the line into clinical anxiety. And then they start to have these kind of like endless racing thoughts about, worried thoughts about what could happen and what could go wrong. And they can't really just turn it off. So we all have worry, right? But we can pull it back in. We rein it in. But if it's a clinical level of anxiety, you have a hard time shutting it down again. And then it starts to, when it grows to the most severe end of it, it starts to cause avoidance, the school refusal, saying they're sick all the time so that they can't go to school and it's, days in a row. Not taking social invites, not wanting to go out in public, starting to isolate and stay in their room. Those are the dividing lines for you to know that's worry to worry about.
And the problem with avoidant anxiety is it actually does work in the short term. So it is reinforcing in the short term, and then it tends to generalize. So a child will first pull back from one activity, feel a little bit of comfort in the short term,
Right.
and then want to do it again and again and again. And we're going to get to this later, but that's where parents are often in this terrible position of wanting to comfort, but also knowing that they need to get their child to not avoid these situations.
Right. And so I would say the number one question during an intake with a parent, it is always, I don't know if I'm overreacting. They always say, I'm not sure if this is a big deal or not. Is this normal for a kid to do this? They always will say this. And so this is a little bit of a guideline for you to say, okay, where does my kid fall? Is it on the right or the left column? That's a way for you to help differentiate whether it's something that needs more clinical attention, somebody like a professional. So what we wanted to focus on, because we know SEPAC members, a lot of parents have children with special needs as part of the group that brought us all together. We wanted to talk a little bit about how anxiety can look different when you have a child with special needs. So just what I mean by special needs is that the children have a disorder, something like attention deficit or a processing disorder, auditory processing, sensory processing, any learning disorder, and of course the spectrum, the autism spectrum. So that's what we're referring to when we say this. So a child, what's important about the difference of anxiety in these populations is that the child has a neurological condition. So a neurologically based condition expresses anxiety differently. And again, it's the same differentiation, the stress versus anxiety. So stress goes away, right? It gets triggered, but it goes away. Anxiety, a switch gets turned on, they're really hijacked by that emotion. When you think about a neurologically based condition, the default is a hair trigger to go into that mode of being anxious and really kind of what we would call a sensory kind of meltdown. So when somebody has a neurologically based condition, it expresses the anxiety with that hair trigger, stays in that mode, and needs a different kind of intervention to shut it down, so that they can start to feel better. So the intervention strategy has to actually be different because of the origin of why it's happening in the first place. So does that make sense? Okay. All right.
Can I just say, so
Yeah.
another way to think of it is, if you use the metaphor of volume, all right?
Yeah.
So given enough external stressors, every child will have anxiety. Because how many of you have had a situation where a child has a big event coming up? Or I don't know about you, I could never sleep before the first day of school. Kind of happy anxiety, but also, am I going to like my teacher or whatever? Child with neurologically based disorders, so first day of school would be a 10 on a scale of 0 to 10. They may have the same kind of cortisol flood, which is actually what anxiety is, at a 1 or 2 stimulus, right? So maybe just going to a play group and suddenly there's one new kid in the play group that they don't know. So does that make sense? So every child will have a reaction when it's at the top end of the stimulation kind of volume set, but kids with these neurologically based disorders are going to have a reaction often at the very low end.
Right. And so one example that might be able to help this come to light is what the difference is between somebody who's having, a stressful day where they start to have a tantrum versus somebody who has a neurologically based condition and they start to have what's called a sensory meltdown. So the trigger, like Liz said, the trigger could be absolutely the same, but the reason that somebody goes into these symptoms, it is caused by a different reason. It's brain-based, and to be able to turn it down, the volume back down, that has to be addressed in a completely different way. So somebody who has a regular, everyday, acting out kind of tantrum, right? That's in the regular realm, the wide range of normal. All kids have this at every age. And I don't mean tantrum to mean that they're just a toddler, okay? We have teenagers doing this, okay? So it's driven by the fact that they want something. And what happens is they get what they want and it stops. So the crocodile tears will come and they'll be, throwing themselves on the floor if they're younger or older. And they'll have a tantrum, and when they get the video game back or when they get the problem solved on their side, the behavior stops because it was just to get something that they needed. So it's like a maladaptive way that they're coping. But in a lot of purposeful behavior, okay? So, and like I said, once they get what they need, the behavior ends. A meltdown, when you have a neurologically based condition, they will not be doing it at all for attention. They will do it because that hair trigger happened and they're into this mode that they cannot calm their nervous system back down. And so they need our help, and that's the interventions that I want you to be able to learn today. So there's a difference. All kids may very well have tantrums at different times, but if we know that our child is, has a special need, they might actually be having meltdowns that we can't address the same way. And this is part of why parents get really, really frustrated that sometimes you try something and it works, and sometimes you try it and it doesn't work. And it's because the origin of why it was happening and whether it was a meltdown or not is the differentiation between these.
I think we're going to take questions at the end and also on index cards, but is that okay?
Yes,
Oh, yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Oh, sure. And it could start as a tantrum and then end up in a meltdown. Oh, sure. Oh, yeah, sure. Just in terms of how to soothe the child who's having a meltdown is completely, by the way, don't give in to a tantrum. I've raised 4 kids. I'll tell you that's rule number 1.
Right.
Even if it's a reasonable request, if they go into tantrum mode, no way, Jose. Do you ever give in? But meltdown would just be different in terms of the child just literally can't self-soothe. Yeah.
Right. So I'm actually going to do something to skip ahead to show you right now. At the same moment of talking about this, I want to show you this one slide. This one.
Repeat, many of you came in a little late. We're passing out an email list. We will email you this presentation. Okay, so if you want it and want to refer to it, whatever, we will email it.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, it looked blurry to me. I wasn't sure. Okay, so so while we were just talking about whether somebody's having a meltdown or not, I wanted you to know in that moment, so I wanted the slide to just come right after it, the sequence of what you do to intervene is slightly different. So what do we do when we're upset? Say your spouse is upset. You say, honey, what's wrong? Why are you upset? Like, we start talking, and that's usually our go-to thing. As adults, we always think to talk. We always try to rational approach. It doesn't help kids. So a kid who's in the middle of a meltdown cannot speak at that moment. Just think about the fact that they're not capable of speaking. So the first part is at the bottom. It needs to go in orders. The arrows are going up. The very first thing you do is help them regulate themselves. If they are hijacked by emotion, their brain is switched on to 10, they cannot hear you. It is like talking to somebody who's intoxicated. Try to think of that metaphor. So you have to help them with regulating them. That might be, even though a child might be very angry and acting out, it might actually be that they need to be held, like a hug. They might need, your child best, they might actually need tactile kind of comfort. Relating to them and telling them after you're, soothing them, helping them to regain by doing some breathing exercises with them, helping them regulate their systems so that they can actually regain the ability to reason, then you can start to actually talk to them.
And can I just say something as the mom? And I learned this, luckily, early on. Often children who are starting to have the meltdown, especially from anxiety, if you go to reason first, they get really angry because to them it feels invalidating. So they feel like you're just trying to fix the problem, like fix them. Does that make sense? And so it's kind of counterintuitive because, of course, as parents, we want to relieve the suffering right away. So what would work for us to be listened to or helped. Although even as an adult, if you don't have an anxiety disorder, how annoying is it if you're just venting to a friend and they immediately start trying to solve your problem? You kind of just want to smack them, right? I mean, isn't that one of the age-old male-female kind of stereotypical differences for cis people, right? So kids will get to reason, but first they need you to just be in the space that they are. And with my one daughter that has severe anxiety, I used to just hold her on the floor, just kind of rock her. Sometimes she'd let me kiss her head. Sometimes she'd even smack me if I tried to kiss her or whatever. But then she would like melt down, cry. Mm-hmm. Then, oh, this girl's really mean. She took away my hat and gloves. She said I was a baby. Like it would kind of come out, after a while, but not. If I kept saying, what happened? What happened? What happened? It would be an invalidation. Does that make sense? Because they can't say it yet.
Right.
So it kind of feels like you're jumping to the solution, right? And it could be as quick as just 2 or 3 minutes of staying with regulate to get to problem solving to make all the difference in the world.
Right. Absolutely. That's what the relate part of it is in the R's, staying with them in the moment. So the thing about anxiety is that we started with what is anxiety versus just everyday stress? And then what is the cause of it? Because if we don't know the correct cause, we can't put the right plan into action to help them. And then we're going to deal with the fact that there's a lot of co-occurring conditions at the same time as anxiety that makes the picture very messy and really confusing. This is why this is a very hard issue. I'm not surprised that this is this popular of a topic, right? We all, look to the left of you and look to the right of you. All of you are dealing with the same thing. Anxiety is hard and it's messy to understand. Why is it happening? What's triggering it? And how do we try to quell it? So one of the big things that happens is we're trying to understand, is it anxiety or something else? That's the next big question. And the most common co-occurring thing that happens with anxiety is we get a lot of inattentive symptoms. And so we start to wonder as parents, do they have attention deficit issues? Is this something that they should, be brought to a professional for? So we want to explain one of the main things is that anxiety can cause inattention. So I can't tell you how many professionals, usually physicians and pediatricians, that send us clients that say, I think they have ADHD, just, double check. And we evaluate them and we find out it's actually anxiety. So anxiety hijacks your brain, makes it impossible for you to pay attention to what's in front of you, right? It makes perfect sense. So the key is anxiety can be causing the inattention symptoms, and it may not even be attention deficit.
And this is one of the real problems with the DSM-5, and most professionals would admit to you, it's a consensus-based document book based on observable symptoms. And any good physician will tell you, you can have the same cluster of observable symptoms, but physicians are lucky they could do a blood test to say, well, is it anemia or is it mono? Is it whatever?
Yeah.
So what does a good psychological evaluation do with educational pieces? It looks at what's causing the observable symptoms. How many times, which by the way, I caught up with that young man. We had a lovely young man, gifted IQ, extremely gifted IQ, who had been wrongly diagnosed in a brief clinical interview as ADHD. Right. Had been given the medicine, which, by the way, if you don't have ADHD, but you appear inattentive because you have severe anxiety, ADD medicine often makes it much worse sometimes people have both. And that people can have comorbidity, have both. This young man either took the medicine, cheeked it, ignored the medicine, etc., but kept saying, like, this isn't working, but was very compliant. So he went around, so Dr. Murphy correctly diagnosed him. And I have to say, he still has pretty bad anxiety, but he's a different way of being able to attend and concentrate. He's successfully in college. His life is completely different. He had basically failed out of college, even with a gifted, probably a .005 level IQ, because his anxiety was so overwhelming and had been wrongly diagnosed as ADHD alone. Does that make sense? So it's really important to get the differential reason for the observable behavior.
Right. Okay. So being in the world of an anxious mind, if we try to put ourselves in our kids' frame of mind, they have all of these thoughts floating around in their head, and it's making them, question themselves, constant thought loops of worries. And so, of course, you can't pay attention. And then there's also a situation, another third of the time when anxiety is actually caused by being inattentive. And I'll tell you from my poor daughter's life is literally all day long, every day being told she's doing something wrong. Imagine that life. It makes you anxious and very sad because teachers, parents, adults, even other kids are constantly correcting them, telling them they're doing something wrong. Yeah, it's a demeaning kind of experience to live this way. So when you're inattentive and you're always having to be corrected, people used to always put their hand on her face to put her towards them to look at her, and she'd be like, why is this person touching my face? So inattention can make you become emotional, including anxiety and also, unfortunately, depression as well. So the life of somebody who is inattentive is that they're always getting criticized. And so it's hard to be diagnosed with ADHD or ADD in your life and go unscathed by, any emotional consequences. They usually will be caused by having the life of somebody with ADD. And then the last point, like Liz mentioned, is that it absolutely could be both. So the difficulty with this whole picture is that, the answer could be yes to both. And so they have to simultaneously, or quite honestly, sequentially dealt with, because if the anxiety is not treated first, it can cause the same kind of problems because you give stimulants to somebody with anxiety, they get even more anxious. So
sometimes it makes them focus on the ruminating thoughts.
Yeah,
so
not good.
They get stuck even more in ruminating.
Yeah. So there's a lot that can, get messed up in the picture if we don't know what the underlying causes are. So not only knowing what anxiety is, but knowing, what the causes are is really the issue. So the other thing that is a common comorbid issue with anxiety is that people may not meet criteria for a sensory integration disorder or like a sensory processing issue, but it is very common co-occurrence. Basically, people who have sensory processing issues, a lot of kids with special needs across the board have this. They have trouble integrating all the different senses of the world. We used to think there were only 5 senses, touching, hearing, taste, smell, and sight. But now we also know there's internal senses, our awareness of our body, which is proprioception, and awareness of our ability to move, which is vestibular awareness. And so there's 2 different kind of versions of sensory processing issues that happen, and these are very often the triggers for anxiety in kids. So there are some kids that need to seek out sensory stimulating activities. So they'll crash into things. These are the kids that like to run around and jump and play and bang things. They get messy. Those are sensory craving kind of kids. And then there's the sensory avoidant kids who very often end up anxious because they cannot handle the overwhelming stimuli from all the different senses all day long. I mean, imagine if you were assaulted by environmental stimuli all day long. It makes you anxious as a result. So these are the kids that will, like, put their hands over their ears when, you have to flush a toilet, usually in public places. When you go to a loud restaurant, they tend to have more meltdowns. So these things go together. And then there's also that quiet person that kind of like is sensory avoidant, and they start withdrawing, and they're kind of quiet and freeze up. So these underlying sensory issues could be the cause for somebody's anxiety as well. And so when doing an evaluation, it's really important to know. But you'll see these are things that, parents are the ones on the front lines of knowing whether these issues are occurring and then bringing it to someone. So these things are very common as underlying triggers for anxiety, mostly in ADHD, OCD, and autism. They're very prone to having anxiety because, like I said, by definition, they're overly sensitive usually to the environment. And so, like I said in the very beginning, if we know the cause of it, we know that there's a function of the behavior. They're trying to tell us something. And it's usually, in these cases, the fact that they need to either activate or just quiet down their nervous system. And so,
So one of my favorite lines about this, it actually applies to parenting in general, but there's a lovely parenting teacher and advocate, Bonnie Harris, and she wrote When Kids Push Your Button. She's great. And she talks about looking at all children, but especially this applies to what Mary's saying now, as having a problem rather than being a problem. And it sounds like such a simple statement, but like it's so hard. And I know I had a child who had meltdowns because of these issues, and I had to dress them in overalls so I could actually pick them up in public areas. And luckily that overalls were fashionable at that time, right? But it's hard, isn't it, as a parent, to not get angry, to not react, to not see this child as being a problem. If it's just that simple cognitive shift as parents, my child is having a problem, so my job is to figure out what is the problem, because they can't tell me. And I know for me, that saved my life as a parent like a million times over. Of course, I would forget it too and react because I'm human, especially the third or fourth meltdown in a couple of days, or in the same day, or in the airport, or whatever.
Start to see a pattern.
Sometimes you start to lose your mind. But if you can kind of go back to that mindset of what is my child's behavior trying to communicate, it's really an important premise as a parent.
And that's what we wanted to get to. What can parents do? So first, recognize that behavior is communication. When they can't speak and put words to this, their behavior is what we just have to translate what it means, okay? So they're trying to tell us something. Every behavior has a function. This is another kind of like groundbreaking thought to have. There's a purpose to every behavior. And I don't mean they're being purposeful or willful. They're actually trying to tell you something with their behavior, and then we have to see, what is it creating? Is it helping them avoid something, escape something, be able to do something more that they crave and need to do? And so there's a function to every behavior. And the other thing is that parents can not only understand those parts, but look at what's underneath. So they might need to bolster certain sets of skills. So if anxiety is because of social anxiety, every time they go in a social situation, it could be an underdeveloped set of skills. They don't feel competent to, start conversations with people, how to ask, kids their names. And when they get older, there's bigger issues, but all around the same areas. Also, the anxiety could be underdeveloped skills in different subject areas. So it comes out at school because it comes out when they have to do math or when they have to do writing. It could be a set of an underdeveloped set of skills that we can address by even maybe it's tutoring.
I was talking to a lovely mom before you all got here about her daughter having some reading deficits and then it turning into real school issues and problems. Because imagine how much of the school day is reading. How much of the school day is reading? Imagine if your child my daughter has dyslexia. She was behind in reading. So then every single day she would be behind all day long by the time she got to second grade, all day long, because she didn't read actually till third grade. Wow. And we had to get Orton Gillingham, tutoring for her, et cetera. And she's fine now. She reads for pleasure now. Right. But imagine that, not having that skill, and then it's going to come out in avoidance, anxiety, et cetera.
Exactly. And the other thing is, we've talked a lot about, or we've mentioned school refusal, school avoidance. We want to make sure that we're not accidentally reinforcing problems. So, for example, if they don't want to go to a certain class or they don't want to go to school at all, and we allow them repeatedly to stay home without trying to, understand the whole big picture so that it doesn't continue to happen, we've accidentally reinforced, and the avoidance of something is what makes anxiety worse. It may not sound logical, but it actually is that the number one most effective evidence-based treatment for anxiety is exposure treatment. So if you avoid and don't expose yourself to the actual thing you fear, it becomes more and more entrenched, and so it gets worse and worse. And I have to say, some of the worst, most difficult, challenging cases I've ever had has been school refusal, because by the time you get to that point, there's so much kind of set in stone by then.
Yeah,
so that was the next part. So we've talked about a couple of these things, so I was skipping to it, is that one of the things we want to do is normalize anxiety and explain that there's some level that's expected and needed as part of life. It helps motivate us. It's what gets us, the alarm clock goes off and it makes us get up and go to work, right? And then another thing is really just modeling behavior. So staying calm when your child is anxious, that modeling of calm behavior is very helpful to them. And then also, we talk a lot about trying to modify expectations when there's a stressful situation. So, there's an unusual situation where, once a year, all the routines are changed because grandparents are in the house or something. Not having the same expectations for every morning, you're going to do the same thing. Okay, today's a little different because we have guests staying at the house. Those kinds of things, trying to kind of, model flexibility, kind of cognitive flexibility for them, that we can move and change with what's going on. That's very helpful. And then transitions, when we know that there's going to be something difficult, like starting new school, like we talked about, allowing extra time to kind of like practice the routine, get extra time done, telling them ahead of time what things are going to be happening so that they know what to expect.
I'll give you an example. My two children with anxiety, and luckily I live in Reading. It's a pretty small, 8,291 people. So it was easy to arrange going, meeting with the teacher, seeing the classroom before, etc. But most schools will accommodate. I think a lot of schools have like an open house day.
Yeah, never skip open house.
Yeah.
If your child's
I don't know
anxious.
if they all do, but and then the other piece that's really important is I personally, this is my opinion, but because we're in the midst of it, so we don't have research to prove it, but our culture right now is absolutely toxic in terms of the expectations on kids. And you'll be shocked to hear this. My husband and I are very lucky to have 4 wonderful children, but we're quite unusual in Fairfield County that out of 4 children, only one of them is gifted. Ba-ba-boom. That was a joke. But it is much more important for a child to have frustration tolerance and a work ethic than to be talented. Talent is highly overrated. Yeah. And I personally believe our culture is so toxic that my kids were only allowed to do 1 AP and 1 activity. And can you believe it? 2 of them got scholarships to college. 1 has his doctorate. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying, yes, it's a humble brag, but I'm just telling you that it's possible. I'm just telling you because I've been there, I've done that. And if you have an anxious kid, they're not going to be able. I actually think it's toxic for the non-anxious kids to be taking all these AP classes and all these things and SAT tutoring. Some of the schedules of some of the kids that we have. Yeah. I couldn't do it.
Yeah. We have a hard time fitting in therapy appointments.
I'm like, holy moly. Yeah. So we have to look at the environment very careful, and it's okay for us to have our own rules for our own kids in terms of limiting the stimulation.
Yes.
Right? Or letting them have interests that don't necessarily fit the resume building, but that are soothing to them and helpful. And that's, maybe that's a politically incorrect point. It's just success is achievable in our culture without some of the driven, I would say kind of hypnotic worship of doing more for the resume. In fact, we're kind of creating anxiety in many kids that didn't have anxiety most of their childhood by the expectations rising wildly in high school. Right. It's my personal opinion. I think we'll have data in a few years after our poor kids have gone through this system. So I think it's just back to common sense. Right. More than 1 activity for many kids is too much with a busy school day.
Yeah.
You know, it's just the way that it is. I don't know about you guys. We had like one thing. I was on the field hockey team. We practiced twice a week.
Yeah.
We didn't go to clinics and overnight camps and this
Jamborees
and
and-
that. I mean,
yeah.
jamborees all day, all weekend.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just a little bit too much what we're expecting of a child, particularly back to any kind of child with learning challenges or anxiety. The culture itself can be, what's the word?
Anxiety
It's heterogenic.
Yeah.
It's actually causing some more of the symptoms.
Right, definitely. And this might sound like common sense as well, but there's some back to basics things that are absolutely critical when it comes to kids that have anxiety. So like we talked about modeling calm behaviors, but then also we want to make sure that things are predictable as much as possible using routine. There's a fancy name for this called cognitive offloading. Like you don't want to have all these things that you have to remember in your head. You want routine. You want the stuff to just like automatically happen in the morning, not think, oh, I got to do this and I got to remember to put this in my book bag. And, you know, because there's a million things that kids have to do and manage for themselves. And we have to remember and manage too. So the more they can kind of automate this process is really a lot of offloading that's better for anxious kids. And then we just want to point out like just a universal issue that we see with kids all the time, no matter how old they are, is that nobody's really getting adequate sleep and related to being overscheduled. And so sleep deprivation is causing a lot of worsening of all these symptoms, especially anxiety is prone to this. And then we're going to talk about when to know how to get help from a professional. But I wanted to give you a few things that are, like if you sign up for the slides, you'll get this, and so it'll be easier for you to write this all down rather than write it down. But I wanted you to know when you have younger kids or even older kids, you know, middle school and even high school, you can start to make sure the kids have an emotional vocabulary, that they understand how to relate, how they're feeling, and have like shorthand language with you so that you don't have to have this difficult conversation of how are you feeling? You know, kids are not going to answer and you're going to get yes or no answers or, you know, just staring at you. So when kids are young, especially the social emotional curriculum that sometimes schools have, and now this is something that's publicly available because it's very successful, is this whole series called the Zones of Regulation. And it's in the slides on the resources page. It explains where to locate these resources for parents. There's a whole section of the website that explains how to use books, this zone of regulation to explain how they're feeling. So you can say, you know, when somebody, especially when there's meltdowns, you know, being able to say when they're angry, you know, are you feeling like you're in the red zone? That they might be capable of actually speaking. Instead of, like I said before, they can't really speak when they're having a meltdown. But when you have shorthand language like this, they not only identify how they feel, but they also can speak it without having large volumes of things to have to say. So, so this socialthinking.com website is a great resource for parents to be able to use. There's lots of little graphic novels to be able to kind of move with the age group of your child. So you start with kind of giving them emotional vocabulary, then using the storylines that they have, and even they have playing board games as well. It's a really good series of resources for parents. When we talked about sensory integration issues, knowing that if a kid is overstimulated, these are things that could be very soothing. These pictures happen to be little kids, but I have to tell you, when you even have, you know, a 21-year-old who is anxious, you get them a weighted blanket, and they'll be your best friend. They will love it, you know. And being able to use, yeah, all of those things. Adults actually end up liking it. The parents play with it with the kids. But adults, especially when you see this stretchy one, the blue thing is a sensory kind of like a blanket. But the weighted blankets are just heavier and they're so soothing. They're great for insomnia, anxiety. I urge any adult to try this because it's very soothing. And then I wanted you to know that there's a lot of, you know, we call the internet www.everything, right? www is also the wild, wild west. You don't know what is a good resource out there. And so I wanted you to have vetted resources that are go-to staples for you to be able to look up what is something that you can do with your child. So there's vetted resources, and one of them is an actual, like, from 7 to 13 years old. They break up what kind of activities would be appropriate by age group. And Coping Cat is a version of cognitive behavioral therapy that is one of the two most important, has the most evidence base for helping kids with anxiety. And parents can actually do these modules themselves. I very often will have people come in the office and get introduced to it, and then they are able to use the parent resources and continue with it.
Can I just say, too, if you're seeking therapy, outside resources for your child, be very clear, and any professional should gladly tell you what their training is. What we used to call therapy as usual, which is just a child going in and talking about how they feel, actually makes anxiety worse, because they repeat and ruminate about things that make them anxious that are not rational. Cognitive behavioral therapy, and it has many derivatives, there's many different forms of it, helps the child to see their thoughts as separate from reality. So it helps them to see their thoughts from the third person. And actually, it benefits everyone. We have little things all over our office, like your thoughts are only thoughts, they're not real. You don't need to believe everything that you think. Regular therapy, where a kid just goes in and talks about how they feel, can actually reinforce and make anxiety worse. And it's really, really important, if your child does have anxiety, to find therapists that are trained in cognitive behavioral therapy that really use either dialectical behavioral therapy or straight cognitive behavioral therapy, and have been using them for a while, so that they really know how to address the symptoms directly, rather than, because you know this, if you've talked to your anxious child, their brain is like the bouncing ping pong ball. It's like from this to this to this to this to this. You could sit for 2 hours and talk about it, but you won't get to a relief of the symptom. You won't get to a relief of, and the other thing that kids love about cognitive behavioral therapy is, after a very short period of time, they can just use the skills on their own at home.
Yes.
And don't need to have contact with the therapist. It's just, we even do recorded, we do different exercises with the child, breathing exercises, and we record them in their little smartphones or their iPads or whatever. Or if they're young, the mom's smartphone, and then the mom can do it. And they can just listen to the exercises and calm themselves at home. Yeah. And so they really start to feel a sense of autonomy and agency to be able, because one of the worst things about anxiety is feeling that it's just hitting you and you have no control. And when you learn some of these cognitive behavioral techniques, you feel agency yourself to be able to soothe yourself, which is extremely therapeutic. Yeah. Really helps.
Right. So some of the resources that would help guide you through productive kind of conversations like this with a child, not just venting kind of sessions with your kid, is this collection of, this is for the younger kids, and then these are for older kids, when you start to have young adults and teens. And then what we were talking about that I really want to empower you to be able to do, what I would like you to be able to do is to be able to teach self-empowerment, self-regulation tools that they can use on their own. The worst part about anxiety is feeling like it comes out of absolutely nowhere and they have no way to stop it. So if they can learn regulation tools like mindfulness and biofeedback, it is the most empowering thing you can really do for the kid. So I start with younger kids, and then I show you some older kid, really well-vetted apps that are helpful to guide kids through mindfulness to address stress and worry. So starting as young as Sesame Street, we're talking about 2 years old and up, you can start using these resources. It helps with giving them visualization tools, affirmations, how to go to sleep, quiet their minds so that they can go to sleep, all the things that, that we as parents struggle with, because that's when anxiety really comes out the most, right? When they're trying to go to sleep. Then we have a series of apps that are about yoga and how to do breathing exercises. When kids learn how to do that, they realize it's always with them. And they're like, oh, I could be at school, I could be in an unfamiliar situation and actually make myself feel better. That is the most rewarding thing, to see that they actually feel better and they're able to do it whenever they need to. as you get older, and even adults, so the parents can use these as well. I have this on my phone. Calm and stress check is a way to actually have guided breathing, and also this stress check one is a way to, the stress guide, I'm sorry, is the one to teach you to do biofeedback. So biofeedback is just a way of teaching you how to regulate your breathing and to bring your stress levels down. And so people never realize this, but because we all have smartphones, pretty much, right? Because we have a camera, there is an infrared sensor that's in our phones. So that reads our pulse if we put our finger onto our phone. And so apps are able to actually read your pulse and give you the biofeedback, which is feedback about your pulse. And it'll tell you your stress level, and it'll show you a depiction of kind of like an EKG strip, and you'll be able to see the wave of your breathing pattern to show whether you're actually bringing yourself into regulation, which it shows you. I'll show you a slide too. So you get to learn that it's right as quickly as grabbing your phone that you can actually start to use breathing, see, from your phone that you're actually getting the breathing into, a calmer zone. There's stress zones that it'll show you. This is really fascinating to show them because they get to see in the office or through the app. They're able to see at the top. That's the breathing, the pulse reading, and it's showing that is a classic stress pattern. So when it translates in the bottom there in the right corner, and it's 96 out of 100 is their stress score. This is somebody before any training, and they're very stressed. So that chaotic kind of up and down breathing pattern is causing their heart rhythm to actually look like that. As soon as they learn the breathing pattern that we teach them, they're able to change it, sometimes even in the first session, to being that calm, steady, even pattern at the top there, and changing their red score down to 10, 11.
And think about stress. Back to our ancestors, stress and anxiety are, well, it's an interactive phenomena, but they aren't experienced by the body except for the expression of cortisol, which is one of the endocrines. Cortisol is dissolved by deep breathing and concentrated breathing. Shortness of breath builds up the cortisol, and also other toxins in the system, and carbon dioxide builds up in the body. So literally doing regulated deep breathing clears out the chemical from your body. And it just sounds too simple to work, but it does. So why do, right principles are manifested and show themselves in cultures all over the world over and over again. Every world religion has a meditative breathing practice. Even for Christians, which tend to be, a little bit more white and uptight, there's the rosary, where you're supposed to breathe deeply in, or there's the Jesus prayer. All other religions have a self-soothing, self-regulating, meditative stance. Why? Because it helps human beings to feel better. It's just a fact. So what biofeedback has done is it's systematically analyze what is it that's so soothing about deep breathing and meditation and yoga. What is it? What's the science? So that you don't have to associate it with a non-secular practice. You can just simply take what works from the practice and use it yourself.
Absolutely. And I have to say, I do so many different things with therapy, testing, and in my career, I've done so many different types of things. And I still will always say this is the most rewarding thing that I ever do with somebody, because somebody who feels like life is just happening to them and they're bombarded by anxiety and they can't get out of it. And for them to see the look on their face when they're like, oh my God, I feel better. And I did that myself. It's the most rewarding thing to see somebody do that. And kids are amazing. They literally learn this breathing pattern in one session. They're like awesome at this. Adults can do it too, but it's just a lifetime of stress built up in our system that takes a long time to unwind, right? So the last thing I really want to focus on is just saying that, like I said before, like we have a roadmap for physical illnesses, but we don't know what to do when we hear these emotional symptoms are coming out with our kid. And so we want to make sure that when there's that dividing line, when you see that something is, like I said, clinical anxiety, that's the time at which you would ask for a professional input. You would want to have a comprehensive evaluation to know what type of anxiety. It could be OCD, it could be trauma related, it could be rooted in all different things that would have a different treatment plan. It's not one size fits all. And then we would want you to know that there are anxiety-specific treatments. So there's biofeedback, there's a cognitive behavioral therapy meant for children, the coping cat. There's EMDR if it's trauma-related anxiety. There's applied behavior analysis if the kid's having trouble in school especially. That's something you want to advocate for and get into your plan with your PPT team to make sure somebody's doing a functional behavior analysis. And then through having a professional evaluation, you also get parent coaching, and you can have a lot of things that are very practical, like teaching about how to improve sleep. And a lot of early intervention in these areas can make a huge difference for them. And we talked about biofeedback, but I just want to let Liz talk about these last couple of things that we also could make sure we focus on.
So it's interesting. So if we look at what works to manage anxiety from a physiological basis, I don't know how many of you, I am not ashamed to say I'm addicted to exercise. And I used to be a runner. My knees are very bad right now, so I'm doing other things. If I don't exercise every day, I do feel the stress of my job. I have a very stressful job. Both my parents are very ill right now. I will feel it in my body and have sleep, and I'm not prone to anxiety at all, but I can feel the cortisol buildup, etc. Now, it's hard to get kids to exercise without organized activities because we really don't do recess the way we used to. I'm a big believer in recess, but families, you can hike together, you can do things with them together, because exercise really does. It's one of the only other things besides deep breathing that eats up cortisol. Because what is cortisol? It's Mother Nature flooding you to prepare you to run away from danger or forage for food, etc. So exercise really is key. There's some interesting studies out of some of the countries in Scandinavia and also in the EU have invested a great deal of R&D money into looking at nutritional ways of dealing with anxiety. And there's a lot of foo-foo crazy advice out there that isn't accurate. Oh, sure. Oh, yeah, Mary, sit down. But we do know that the brain is made out of almost 1/4 omega-3 fat. Omega-3 fat can be found in root vegetables and in fish and in nuts especially. And our ancestors, that's what they ate. That's what they ate when we were developing into the biggest brain, primate. So unless your family is like meticulous with their diet, and I'm a pescatarian, I eat mostly vegetarian, but fish added, but I still take a very high dose of omega-3 fatty acids every day. If you look in blood samples of people with high anxiety and depression, it's a correlation, it's not a causation. They have very low levels often of available vitamin D3 and the omega-3 fatty acids. And so I have a kid that won't swallow capsules. Well, none of my kids live with me anymore, but I used to pour omega-3 in smoothies in the morning. Like there's ways, I bake a banana bread, which by the way, you didn't know this, but I sneak tons of omega-3 oil into my banana bread, which I cook for my staff. And yep. With the flaxseed, I got flax oil in there. Oh yeah. So there are easy ways to get that in there. It's good for what ails you. And the reason it helps anxiety and it helps with depression and other ailments is if you think of it this way, if your brain isn't nutritionally sound, if you don't have enough of the nutritional elements that your brain needs, the inefficiency then will express itself in the way that the brain operates. Does that make sense? So it's not magic. It's just like if you don't have the right ingredients, the amino acid chains that your brain needs, there will be an inefficiency in the way it operates. And in fact, in Scandinavian countries and in the EU and in Canada, you won't have a child ever diagnosed with anxiety where there isn't a nutritional assessment and they give all kinds of supplements and whatever. And then occasionally, even a younger child, say 10, 11, 12, might benefit from certain kinds of medications sometimes, but always you want to do this assessment. And by the way, a lot of things that are, recommended by naturopaths have not been submitted to double-blind studies. That is still the golden rule. Like you really want to use a double-blind study. And it's not that hard to do a double-blind study. They've done this with these different nutritional supplements where they actually give a gel cap full of water versus the gel cap full of omega-3. And then they measured the differences in the dosing and how it affects the behavior. So again, look this up yourself. Don't ever believe me. We also know that probiotics. How many of you have read anything about the microbiome? Okay, really great book. but you can't read it if you're really squeamish. It's called 10% Human, referencing only 10% of the DNA in our body is human DNA. 90% comes from the microbiome. These are little parasites, viruses, bacteria, coexisting organisms that help us digest our food, that keep our skin from having rashes and ailments, etc. Lots of research in the microbiome being affected by different things like antibiotics and also just, poor diet, etc. And I personally take a probiotic every single day. I have my 2 elderly parents on it. Elders have a lot of problems with digestive issues and stuff like that. Really, but you don't want to just like go willy-nilly with it. You want to get some good advice about it. But the microbiome can really be affected. And if you eat, again, a diet that would be more like what our ancestors ate, they ate a lot of pickled food. They kept food preserved in vinegar and stuff like that. That'll give you enough. You don't need a supplement. There's a lot of double-blind research on that being helpful. So gut-brain connection, we don't have time to get into that today, but if you guys are obviously eager enough to come out in the middle of your day to come to this kind of forum, there isn't one answer to all of this, but it's very interesting and intriguing to me. In fact, I often say this to Mary and my colleagues, if I could go back to graduate school, because when I was in graduate school, they said the brain was a black box, and they pretty much believed everything was learned behavior. Not so much. But there is, if you just think of it, our brain is the body and the body is the brain. And we really do need to look at like what we eat and how we live. And in that case, I'm going to say another thing about our culture. Our culture doesn't really reinforce self-care and doesn't really reinforce eating well, et cetera. It's getting a little bit better. I think definitely better from when my oldest kids were younger. But that's all I'll say about that. So really look into that for your child. And the omega-3s, you can sneak into them. They have kind of the gummies and stuff like that too, that are omega-3 and even probiotics that can really help. So that may be helpful to your child as well.